All right, welcome to MC 201. This is Thursday, December 21st, and we're covering the third chapter of the textbook. We've so far covered syllabus and course overview, chapter 1, chapter 2, and now chapter 3. Tomorrow there will be an exam. Questions can come from any of those different lectures. You might get a couple of questions from the syllabus just to make sure that you're paying attention to the kind of overall format and structure of the class. And then we'll go through the first three the first three chapters. Pay attention to what was on the quiz. Obviously, pay attention to what's in the PowerPoint slides. Most of the questions from the first two tests on the first two Fridays are going to come from those lectures and from kind of the big picture slide presentations and whatnot. When it comes time for the final, though, I don't want you to be surprised that there are questions that come out of the textbook, because there will be. So you still need to be reading the text. I'll give you a review sheet for the final exam. But in talking to students in one-on-one meetings, I realize it would probably help if I put out an expectation of the final exam already, since it's coming up relatively quickly in this short session. So I'll do that. I'll give you the breakdown of the points and where things are going to come from, but I'll do that in writing so it doesn't take up any more time in this lecture. So this is it. This is Media Literacy and Media Studies. This is chapter 3 in the textbook, and it's one of my favorite topics to talk about, so let's just move through it, and I'll try not to make this last more than 25 or 30 minutes. Media literacy is a core concept. It just means understanding how mass media work. It's about citizens or media consumers or the general public having some understanding of where these messages that surround us all the time come from, and why they are the way they are. It means developing critical thinking skills to analyze the world around us and the messages that we receive. It also includes knowing where different types of information can be found and how to evaluate that information, thinking about who owns the mass media and what their motives are, what their benefits are for presenting information in certain ways, and think about how different interests are represented in mass media. Think about the way when you watch news, it's not just did that story sound too liberal or too conservative, but what sources did they choose? Did they choose regular people? Did they find out how it's going to influence people? Any given issue is how it's going to influence people now, next year, 5 years out from now. Those are questions to be asking whenever you're watching news, but also whenever you're watching entertainment content. A lot of the stuff that I used to really enjoy growing up watching, that one way or another came from, for example, from Miramax, from Harvey Weinstein's company, has a totally different frame now because he's such an awful abusive person, and so it's almost hard to watch some movies that are relatively classic films, because now there's a new frame, and that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the person writing the film or the actors in it, but just information and media can reshape the way you think about other information. Sometimes it's on purpose, sometimes not. Most of what we're talking about today is what's on purpose, is how messages are framed, and being literate about where they come from. All right. So media literacy is knowing where mass media messages come from, who's producing them, who owns them. There's this link in here to a book by Ben Bagdikian, who talks about how only 5 major media companies own just roughly 5 mass media companies own most of the mass media outlets that you see. So it's not like they own all of it. It's just greater than 50%. But that means that on average, maybe 10% of the messages that you see come from one of these 5 companies. Some are going to be more than 10%, some are going to be less. But Time Warner, Walt Disney, News Corporation, somebody didn't copy correctly here on their blog, News Corp, Viacom, Bertelsmann in Germany, they make up the media monopoly. And Bagdikian's been tracking the consolidation of mass media from when there were maybe 50 or 40 or 25 major media companies that controlled more than half of the mass media messages that entered the general population. Now it's down to 5. So he's been tracking that since the 80s. Let's see what else we got here. Critical thinking and practice. It's important for you to be critical thinkers because employers want people who can solve problems. One of the ways you get to become better at critical thinking is by analyzing the world around you, and so it's not always negative, but it's not always positive either. You need to develop the ability to think strategically, think about where things are coming from and where things are going in order to solve problems. But once you start applying critical thinking skills to the mass media, I think some interesting questions arise. When you start asking questions, more questions come up, is what I'm saying. You need to ask these questions of mass media, of any message that you see, whether it's a news message or an entertainment message, something your friend's sharing on Facebook. Where does the news source get its information from? Is it well sourced? Who owns this medium? What are their purposes for putting this message out there? Do they have a political bias? Do they have a particular industrial concern that they're trying to represent? You need to understand who owns the message, who owns the press or the the publication can strongly influence what's said on there. What sources do they choose? I already touched on this, but do they mostly talk to officials for news content, or do they talk to regular people too? In entertainment, do they employ writers and producers with diverse backgrounds, or is it the usual suspects? You need to be asking yourself these questions, and that's not to imply it's right or wrong necessarily. Any given writing team might be made up of different groups of people, but on the whole, mass media generally, a lot of entertainment messages are still produced by white males in power, and from that perspective, and it's just one perspective. It's a limited perspective. It's not all bad, but if you're thinking critically about who produces entertainment content and what sources are used in news content, you can start to ask if sort of the full spectrum of American culture and our society are represented. You also need to look at how messages are being framed, but we'll talk about that when we get down to framing theory, so we don't need to spend a ton of time on this. Critical thinking questions for you to apply include who, what, when, where, why, and how, which is kind of interesting because those are also the questions that journalists ask. So journalists, even when they're acting in an objective manner, they're doing critical thinking, which, if you apply a critical eye to our society, if you apply critical thinking, if you just ask where things come from and who do they benefit and why are they there and who's talking and who's the owners and what are their interests here, if you apply critical thinking skills to a system that is a capitalist system, then it's going to look like you're being critical of it. That's just how it is. We need critical thinking about the way things work to help them function more efficiently, help them function better, help them function more fairly. I'm not saying things are going to become perfectly fair or that news media don't make mistakes. They definitely do all the time. But oftentimes what looks like so-called liberal bias is just people asking, does this system need to function this way? Why is it functioning this way? And the system that they're critiquing is a capitalist system. So it looks, on the other hand, like there might be some left-wing bias when, from my experience as a broadcast journalist, in the newsrooms I worked in, people had a wide variety of political positions. They were just doing critical thinking for their jobs. All right, critical media theory. This is kind of the more scholarly academic approach. It is Marxist in its traditions. It critiques our socioeconomic structure. It critiques the capitalist structure and how things are produced and who they're produced for. The ultimate question is not should government control media. The ultimate end is not to employ some type of government control over the means of production of information. That would just be giving a monopoly to government instead of to 5 global corporations. It also go against our Constitution and First Amendment to hand over any kind of government control for speech. But it asks who benefit from media and the social structures in place that are reified, if you will, by media. And I just threw out a big grad school term, but what I mean by reified is you look at social structures the way they are they just reiterated and reinforced by the way mass media work, or are they questioned or challenged in meaningful ways? That's something you need to be asking as you consume mass media. Could the way mass media produce messages and release them, could it improve? And how are you going to help? Those are questions mostly for people who want to major in this field, but it's something everyone could be thinking about because of our participatory media culture. All right, symbolic interactionism is another theory. We're going to kind of blaze through these different mass media theories. This one actually applies in all types of communication, interpersonal communication, and mass communication. If you're going to think critically, you need to understand how mass communication and all types of communication work. Symbols have meaning. Meaning is constructed. That means it's applied to things not inherent in the actual thing. Mass media use symbols to reinforce information and challenge existing institutions. What are we talking about? Well, I mean, which institutions are challenged at any given time and why? You know, there's always change happening, and there are also a lot of structures that just kind of stay the same no matter what people are saying about them. When you look at symbols and how they are used, I'm encouraging you to note, is this symbol being called upon to defend existing structures and the way they function, or are they challenging them? Which ones are being challenged and why? The theory of symbolic interactionism goes back to George Herbert Mead. And like I said, it's not just what symbols are chosen in mass media, but also how we communicate to each other using all manner of symbols, using language, words as a symbol, pictures as a symbol. The takeaway here, if I'm asking you on a quiz, is that symbolic interactionism means meaning is constructed. It's made up. We have to have agreed upon symbols to be able to talk to each other, right? We have to agree that these sounds I'm making, these morphemes have meaning, right? These phonemes, sorry, the sounds are phonemes. The written word is morphemes. At any rate, we have to decide that when you write, I guess I can go to the board. No, I don't want to do that. That would take too long. What if I just showed you the tree? All right, this is a sort of classic slide. It's silly, but if you think of a tree, do you think of the image of the tree or the word tree? Why does TREE mean tree? Because long ago, people who lived way before us agreed that that's what we would call it. It doesn't need to be called TREE. In Spanish, it's arbol, which is really not related to tree at all in a linguistic sense, not that directly related anyway at all. Arbol, doesn't sound anything like tree. There are different ways of communicating the concept of a tree. If you drew a Christmas tree right now, would that still make people say tree? Yes. It would make people think about tree? Yes. Just a different kind of tree, right? So symbols have meaning. We have to agree upon it ahead of time. And when you're brought up through a culture in a society, you're taught what the symbols mean in our culture, right? You're taught that TREE means tree and not ARBOL until you go to junior high school and you study Spanish, I guess. All right. We'll hit other more specific to mass comm theories now. There's a handful of these and then we're done. First one's agenda setting. It tells us that mass media tells us what topics we should be considering and how to prioritize them. And then there's a second level agenda setting that tells us that mass media can tell us if these things should have positive or negative connotations, and some other attributes can be added to them. But this is the basic model of agenda setting. You are the audience person down here, and it's just a dude, but obviously it applies to men and women and everybody. You perceive reality directly this way, right? I'm talking in the text about trying to do that more and get away from your screen time and get away from your electronic devices and television and computer and actually talk to people in the real world so you have some perception of reality that comes directly from your own observation and by sharing ideas with other people. And then there are a series of filters that go on and prioritizations that go on, which we could call a media agenda. Different media outlets have very different agendas, vastly different agendas, depending on who you're talking about right now. But through that filter, things then come to you, and those also influence your perception of reality. So agenda setting is the one that goes around this way, from reality through a media agenda to our perception of reality. Gatekeeping Gatekeeping is the filtering process. So up here where there's this filtering happening in this agenda, gatekeeping is that process. In the context of demassification, gatekeeping is becoming less important because you have to have a mass audience to filter for, right? But there are still people doing gatekeeping and getting paid to do gatekeeping. And then on the other hand, there are people who do gate watching. I'll be there in a second. There are people who do gate watching, which is like people who look at messages that have already passed through gatekeepers, already passed through filters, and selected items to care about and share them with each other. So the thing about gate watching is people might pull from big, massive mainstream media sources, or they might pull from like their friends' cat videos or whatever. And so it's really hard for me to pause this. So what do you need? You're interrupting my class to say what? Just have the candy. Yes. God. Sorry, guys. All right. So gate watching is when average citizens, mostly they're watching content coming down off of mass media sources, but also it might just be stuff that they or their friends have made or stuff from obscure sources. And all of it is fair game to be pushed up on websites like Reddit or other sites. So gate watching and gatekeeping are two different concepts. I'll definitely quiz you on gatekeeping this week, but be aware of gate watching, this idea that people are setting agendas for each other just because they have the ability to upvote things on sites like Reddit and, God forbid, 4chan, Dig was an old one, Dig.com, Fark.com. These are these websites that are like social aggregators, social bookmarking. And people also gate watch and share on their own Facebook feeds and on Twitter. Those are another place where gate watching content gets displayed or redisplayed. Okay, so gatekeeping is filtering. It looks like this. This is a big fancy model. It basically just says this is a filter. Some stuff comes through and some stuff doesn't. It's a really fancy way of drawing a filter. Some things boing off and other things go through to the audience. That's all this is saying. Here's news. Some of it gets through the audience. The gatekeepers and professional media keep some of it from going. But anymore, if some of these things that bounce off and that don't go through the mass media, you might still have access to them online. You might go find them in other ways if you're really interested. All right, third mass comm theory is framing. Mass media apply frames. Here are some select news frames that you should know about, and then I'll talk about a couple of entertainment frames. These are just kind of basic news frames that are applied. They may or may not be the most popular. I'm picking them because they come top of mind as examples of how news frames work. There are many different types of news frames. One is conflict. Journalists often look for conflict in stories in order to make them more interesting, but sometimes conflict can be played down, sometimes it can be played up, depending on the issue and who the people are who are on, multiple sides. Stories don't always have two sides. Sometimes there are 4 or 5 different groups of stakeholders involved in a specific issue or concern. So be wary of conflict-framed news stories that pit things that sort of make it look like there's only 2 groups. There's a pro and a con, because a lot of times there'll be people who are pro for one reason and other people who are pro for another reason, and some of them might drop out sooner or later depending on how things actually take shape. So there's a lot of stakeholders. There's more than just a dichotomous relationship, but for the interest of time and efficiency, a lot of times mass media will just tell stories as if there were only 2 sides. Another way of framing news is on-your-side reporting. We've seen sort of a resurgence of that in recent years, last couple of years, and that is when news organizations will take the point of view of an individual viewer or somebody with a complaint, try to track down and get results for their complaint, whether it's with the government or with a contractor or with somebody who ended up being a criminal who stole their money off of Craigslist or something. There's on-your-side reporting going on much more often now, perhaps just to try to draw people in, keep them interested, and make them feel that they are a part of the news. Human interest is another way of framing a story. This is just stuff that's interesting. It's just stuff that happens to people. These can be news features. I I'm an old guy who still does appointment viewing with the NBC Nightly News, and they purposefully do a positive news story at the end of every newscast just to have something positive to talk about, so people can't say it's all negative. It's all just negative on your big national news. They always do some type of relatively uplifting, like hometown heroes kind of story, and that's framed as, I would say, human interest. Entertainment frames, so this might be more familiar to you, but if you think about the way different plots are set up in film and in films and novels and TV shows, they may be fairy tale stories, they may be hero tales. The protagonist, such as in comic book movies, protagonist or I don't know, a dozen protagonists. If it's the next Civil War movie, there's probably 15 protagonists or something like that, right? But they're all going out there and it's fighting good versus evil. There are also farces. A farce or absurd frame can be applied in comedy. So here's the conflict frame. This is New York Times' critique of its own coverage of war, showing how New York Times often depicted war as beautiful or purposeful, and ignoring the negative aspects of war. If you think about it, in the past 20 or 30 years, we have not had a lot of images of the negative side of war. For better or for worse, people are not as exposed to that as they were all the way back to the literary journalism of World War I, to on-scene radio broadcasting from World War II, and on-scene film reporting from Vietnam. Just thinking about America's major wars, we don't see as much of the downside of war as we used to. For better or for worse, this conflict frame takes out some elements of the conflict. Okay, that's one critical way of approaching media. Another critical way of approaching media might be if you critique our military too much, you hinder their ability to prosecute a war. So that would be the other side of it, I think. All right, mass comm theories 4 and 5, limited effects, limited capacity model. These are kind of related to each other, so I'm jamming them together in the last slide here. Limited effects paradigm is a collection of theories. A theory is just an abstract way of thinking about behavior. A theory is just a way that hopefully helps us predict how people would behave if they're in the same situation later on, right? The limited effects paradigm says mass media influence us, but not with direct, immediate results. Right, so in the text I talk about this old hypodermic needle theory, which basically just said propaganda takes ideas and injects it into society, and then people believe this stuff. It ain't that easy. All right, there are a lot of other social and cultural conditions that have to be in place for certain types of propaganda to work. Right, and so the limited effects paradigm basically just says yes, mass media have effects, but they are limited. They're not immediate, and the effects of mass media on society and culture are battling with other cultural and social forces to influence the way people think about their world, right? Your church, your family, friends, and the industry that you go to work for, your education, your background, your ethnic background, all those things are going to influence how you receive mass-mediated messages and whether you accept them or not, or what parts of them you accept and what parts you reject. Finally, the limited capacity model talks about our ability to process things. Actual information coming at us is limited. And so how does this relate? Well, if an individual person has difficulty perceiving all the messages constantly coming at us, this is a massive model. All we're looking at here is messages are constantly coming at this person, and this is their brain right here, right? It's not all going to go through and have immediate effect. A lot of it is not even ever going to get stored or be available for retrieval. A lot of it's just going to get processed really quickly based on our existing assumptions or presumptions about stuff. So that model looks massive, but the basic idea is you're constantly hit with information. There's music, there's other people bopping around. You have information on your smartphones constantly coming at you. You don't stop and attend to every message that comes at you. There wouldn't be enough time in the day. You just wouldn't have enough time to read every Facebook post or to contemplate every news story or to think about every, Christmas song that comes on over the radio. So some of them you just go, oh, classic Christmas song, I know that one, not even going to think twice about it. It just goes on in the background while people are drinking coffee in Starbucks or trying to get work done in the office place or something. Other things are not so easy to process. That thing that I just said, where okay, you hear this classic Christmas song, you're like, I know a bunch of classic Christmas songs. It's just one of those. Don't have to worry about it. Not a big deal right now. That's called a heuristic. The processing, right? A heuristic is a fancy way of saying it's a rule of thumb, right? So what's the rule of thumb? You don't even really need to think about a rule of thumb to apply it. You just go, oh, classic Christmas song. I know where that goes in my brain, and it just kind of slides around to the back, and you can attend to your work or your job, or you're texting your friends or whatever you do at work when you're bored. So those are kind of the two ways of attention, right? Things being automatically processed, or you actually having to think about them. When you actually think about things through controlled processing, this one down here, all these other things come into play, your motivations and your emotions. All right, and guess what? I'm not going to quiz you on that stuff. I just want you to know that there's different ways of processing information. You cannot take in every message, and since you can't take in every message in the mass media, it's pretty much impossible for the mass media to have immediate, deep effects on mass groups of people just from putting out 1 or 5 or even 100 messages. However, over a year or over 2 years or over 10 years of the same messages being put out in society, there definitely can be media effects. It can shape the way we view the world. And again, it goes back to symbolic interactionism. When we consistently agree on what words should mean tree, then that has meaning. If we consistently agree on a story about the way our society is and how it functions and how it should function, he's stealing my briefcase. If we consistently think about things in our society the same way with a whole lot of other people, we develop a collective consciousness, and symbols might mean things now that they didn't mean before, right? Symbols, their meaning can change, it can evolve. Okay? There are words that used to be, horrible curse words that now people just say all the time. There are words that we don't say because, we've learned that they are really hurtful to different cultural groups. So there are things that enter and leave our collective consciousness that are appropriate to include or not in our vocabulary. And what ultimately happens is mass media messages are constantly fighting for your attention. They have to go through that individual processing first. Then they might make an impact on society. Then they might need to make that impact over and over and over again for it to go beyond some type of direct behavioral impact to social change, right? And that am I saying that ultimately the goal of all mass communication is social change? No, it's not, but it's the big effect that we're ultimately most concerned about. Hey, come on. It's a big effect that we're ultimately most concerned about when we think about the potential of mass media, the overall purpose of it, all right? So hopefully you got some ideas about media literacy and critical thinking in there. I think I failed to tell you what all the questions would be, but just looking back through the PowerPoint, definitely going to ask you to define media literacy. That's kind of obvious. Definitely going to ask you who symbolic interactionism comes from. Definitely going to ask you, based on a definition, to identify agenda setting, based on a definition to identify gatekeeping, and also I'll talk about the relationship between limited effects, in the broader social sense, and limited capacity in the individual sense to receive and hold on to mass-mediated messages. And framing, I'm more interested in news frames than in entertainment frames. So if I list conflict and on-your-side reporting and human interest, you need to know that those are news frames, and that's just because of my professional background being in news. All right, so hopefully this is helpful to you. Sorry about my kid interrupting. That was Sammy. He's obviously off of school now for Christmas break. So happy holidays, Merry Christmas. The next time you see me will probably be in a really brief pre-Christmas lecture. So I can go back to the photo booth here. Here's the next couple of days. Take the quiz right away today, Thursday's quiz. I'm going to post the test as soon as I possibly can for Friday, and you're going to be able to take that. You'll have a limited hour to take it, but once I post it, I'll just make it available from whatever time tonight until midnight Friday night. Okay, so you can take it wherever in that window works for you to take that test and get it out of the way. Then some point over the weekend I'll post stuff related to Monday, but hopefully you can just watch this really brief lecture and take a really brief quiz and then really not have to do anything on this class on Monday. The day after Christmas, though, we'll be back to another one of these, another sort of maybe more detailed chapter to read with a lecture video and a quiz. So that's the process that we're going to continue to go through. Have a Merry Christmas if that's your thing. If not, happy other holidays. I know we're coming in the end of Hanukkah, I think, pretty soon here. There's other, holidays and stuff going on. So to everybody else, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and